Anytime if you feel, you can exit, right? Because of course you will not be acquainted with the other parts which we have not covered yet. Thank you. ए, इको हो रहा है, इको हो रहा है। जो मैं बोल रहा हूँ मुझे ही इधर से ही खुद आवाज आ रहा है। हाँ? Okay. Hello everyone, good afternoon. Today we will talk about political science and international relations paper 1. This is Dr. Bijendra Sir and we will talk about PSIR paper 1 today, and tomorrow I'll discuss PSIR paper 2. Now we will see, the types of questions which has come in section A and in section B, and then we will see that what could be the appropriate answer in brief, right? So let me begin. If you ask the what are the pattern and trends of the questions this year, no, in paper 1 trends was basically similar as it was asked last year. So if you look at the trends of the last 5 years, there was no change in PSIR paper 1. As far as paper 2 is concerned, there is a change. There are more questions on a recent trend, dynamic pattern. So more questions were from current affairs related rather than traditional one. If you look at the last year or last 4 years questions, even in paper 1 there have been only few questions which has been asked on the current affairs, but this time there are more questions on current affair, right? Now let's see the paper 1, which is actually as per as the last 4 5 years question has been asked. So pattern, there's no changes in pattern. There are simple questions, there are traditional questions, there are questions which has been repeated, right? Now for example, if you look at questions, now look at question number this one first. So this is section A and it has 5 questions, and look at questions here. Explain the philosophical approach to the study of political theory, right? This has been already asked. It is a repeated questions. Now in this one should explain what is political theory. So one can write political theory definition in 2 3 lines, right? Political theory is a systematic and organized reflection of political phenomena, reflection on political phenomena, right? It is a rational analysis of, it is rational and scientific analysis of political institutions, and political phenomena, right? Now there are 2 approach in political theory. If you look at approaches, There are two approaches in political theory. One is called philosophical approach. And second is called descriptive approach. Approach in political theory. Now, philosophical approach actually, concerned with what ought to be questions, very much normative questions, very much value loaded questions. So philosophical approach, focuses on, what ought to be. What ought to be, you know, uh, further, it gives importance to value and norms. It is basically ethical approach to understand politics or analyze politics. It is basically ethical approach to understand and analyze politics. Right? Now, you can contrast with descriptive approach. Now, descriptive approach focus on what is basically. It focuses on what is, right? How people lives. It focuses on how people lives. Whereas philosophical approach focuses on how people should live. But the idea, philosophical approach focuses on how or people should live. Now you can give example of philosophical approach, so and descriptive approach. So several philosophers have opted philosophical approach, like for example Socrates, Plato, right? Now if you look at Gandhi, right, Gandhi had philosophical approach to analyze politics, right? For example, his Plato's idea of ideal state, right, right, or Gandhi ideas of Ramraj. However, if you look at the descriptive approach, many philosophers has adopted it, like for example Machiavelli, right, or for example Kautilya, right, or for example behavioral theorist, behavioral theorists like David Easton, right, and others. And then now you can conclude one line in answering behavioral approach. Sir, can we also use modern thinkers like, yeah, you can do it. You can do it. Modern thinkers like, I use Gandhi, right? So you can use modern thinkers in normative approach, right? Or wherever. So this, should be the appropriate answer. Now let me move to the next question. Now write a note on relations between equality and liberty from the multicultural perspective. Now look at, last from the last 3-4 years question has been repeated. sometimes it is on the name of cultural relativism, sometimes on the name of multiculturalism, sometimes in the on the name of the critique of universal idea of equality and liberty. So if you look at the write a note on the relations between equality and liberty from the multicultural perspective. Now first you have to talk about what is multicultural perspective, right? So you write what is multiculturalism basically. So multiculturalism is a one of the sects or one of the dimension within liberal philosophy to understand liberty and equality, and they are criticizes liberal idea of uniform equality and liberty, right? So you have to define multiculturalism first. What is multiculturalism, right? Or one can write multiculturalism is a value, right, who believes in multi ethnicity, right, multi belief, multi faith. No, first you write multiculturalism. Now come to the liberal perspective of liberal understanding on equality and liberty. Equality and liberty. From liberal perspective, equality and liberty conflicts. There is a conflict between liberty and equality, right? So consider when there is all are equal, then liberty will be harmed. Now come to the modern liberals modern liberals philosopher, and then talk about there is a they actually try to make a balance between liberty and equality, right? For example, Rawls has given priority to liberty, right? But he also tried to make society egalitarian. So he addressed inequality in his second principle of justice, right? Now come to the multicultural perspective. Multicultural perspective. Now multiculturalists, reject the liberal ideas of relations between liberty and equality. For liberals, there are uniform value of liberty and equality. For example, all have equal liberty. That Rawls says. Or for example, for liberty should be the core idea, right? For liberals. But for multicultural, pluralism is a core idea. Pluralism is core idea. Now, yeah, we are free, but we are unequal, right? If you look at society, the modern society are multicultural. People have different faith, value, belief, right? Living styles, right? And they should tolerate each other, right? They should tolerate each others and respect each others. Yet they are all equal. They are different, but they are equal. And they should value pluralism, right? So here you can take name of Isaiah Berlin, who had given idea of value pluralism, right? And make a balanced relationship between equality and liberty. That's what you have to and उतना टाइम भी उतना 150 वर्ड में लिखना है. तो फर्स्ट डिफाइन मल्टीकल्चरलिज्म, देन लिबरल अंडरस्टैंडिंग on equality and liberty, then modern liberals philosophers understanding on equality and liberty. Basically it's asking you relations between equality and liberty, right? So for example, liberals thinks that liberty and equality conflict. Modern liberals argue that they don't conflict, but modern liberals give priority to liberty, and then second priority for them it was equality. But if you look at multiculturalism, they actually talks about pluralism rather than liberty, right? All are different yet equal, right? So that with this one can end. Now look at Macpherson. Basically, he is a CB Macpherson. Right? CB Macpherson is basically socialist thinker who are critical to liberal understanding of power, basically. Right? Now, if you look at liberals, for liberals, liberty is a core value. Liberty is core value. Right? Now, he said that in democracy, for Macpherson, right, there should be balance between liberty and equality. Balance between liberty and equality. Now, if you look at in industrial society, we are living in capitalism. We are living in capitalism. Now, capitalism has two capacity. One is, if you look at it, has developmental power. Developmental power. What does it mean? It can benefit everyone. That is a capitalist society. Or even if you regulate capitalism better, it can benefit everyone. Now, at the same time, the capitalism has extractive capacity or extractive power. Extractive power. What is extractive power? The, the modern society, the modern democracy, tended to earn some benefit. Now, if you look at the modern capitalism, profit motive is a prior than, focusing on the development of individual. Right? So he is very critical to capitalism and modern democracy because of extractive power it has, and he's focusing on developmental power. So he talked about developmental power. Developmental power. What is mean? It is means, it or the state can enhance developmental or capacity of individual. Capacity of individual through various development. Various development like health, education, social security, and so on. That is basically, C.B. Macpherson notion of power. However, we can contrast with the other understanding of power here, right? For example, we can contrast with Robert de Hull power. Robert de Hull power, understanding of power, right? Or Stephen Luke's understanding of power. Right? So some comparison with these two people, Robert de Hull's understanding of power and Stephen Luke's understanding of power. And then again, the final about, writing about what Macpherson talks about. the modern social democracy. He is a champion of social democracy, where you know there should be no only political equality, there should be substantial equality. There should be substantial equality. For example, everyone should have access to education, quality health, right? Everyone should have social security, and so on and so forth, right? So that is a MacPherson. Mention the difference between Italian and German brands of fascism. I never taught, what is difference between German and Italian version of fascism. So first you talk about fascism. What is fascism, right? As an ideology, right? And then talk about, the evolution of fascism, right? It evolved in 1920s to 1940s, right? And there was, of course, there was a Nazi Germany, right? And there was a Fasci Italy. Now, Nazi Germany was more brutal. If you look at it, was a brutal. Of course, it was also brutal, but it talks about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, right? That means the Jew should be eliminated, right? There should be, right. Jew should be eliminated. Fascist also talks about Jew should be eliminated. One major difference about Nazis, German fascism is, you know, racism, super racism. It talks about super racism. It talks about now. Fascist Italy never talked about super racism. German, argue that they are the Aryan race, and this race is the best race in the world. They can make Germany great again, right? So both focused on duty. They both focused on nationalism. Both focused on you know development and industrialization. Both used methodology, right, to mobilize people. Both were critical to dissent. They did not allow other party to flow, right, to flourish. They crushed dissent. They called their dissent as anti-national, right? So there had been several similarity, right? Despite of the several similarity, of course there was some differences between Italian version of fascism and German version of fascism. And differences was this three. It was more brutal. It was based on anti-Semitism. There was no such anti-Semitism. Fascist, Italy version of fascism was not so brutal as German was. As we know that Hitler killed 6 million Jews alone, right? Mussolini did not do that, right? Now it talked about it spreaded anti-Semitism, right? And it talked about super racism. Germans are the supreme race. There is no such propaganda in fascist Italy. However, if you look at, there have been several similarity between Italian and German version of brands of fascism. Now let me move to the next question. Yeah. Explain briefly the elite theory of democracy. So two line about democracy one can write. Democracy, right? Two or three line. And then one can talk about elite theory of democracy. Elite theory of democracy, which believes that in democracy there is a few people rules, right? There is a belief that in democracy it is ruled by people. What happens in democracy, we believe that it is ruled by people. But elitist theory of democracy believe that no, it is a elite, right? It is a meritorious people who actually rules. Now one can give example, right? Example of Mosca, who says there are two classes in this world, ruler and ruled, right? And rulers are basically very active, right? But ruled are very passive. So rulers are always, there in society, right? Now Pareto talks about circulation of elite. He talked about circulation of elite, right? Now what he talked about, that look, you know uh, there's a one set of elite rules every time. At the same time, there are contending elite in every society. There are contending elite. What happened in due course of time? One elite is replaced by the another elite. Elite always remains in power. Elite circulate the other elite, right? So there is always circulation of elite, right? So history of, right, actually the history of the ruling class is basically, you know the graveyard of elitism, right? Basically entire rule is done by the elite. Then one can write about C. C. Wright Mill idea of power elite. Now C. Wright Mill developed theory of power elite, right? CWRI. C. Wright Mill developed idea of power elite, you know, to basically he criticized, pluralist understanding of democracy. Pluralist understanding of democracy. Right. Pluralists believe that democracy means the diffusion of power. Power is basically, remain in several hands, several groups. Now, C. Wright will argue that it is a basically misperception or misunderstanding of democracy. Now, power remains in the elite. And he talked about American democracy, and he said that there are three groups in American democracy who controls power. Now, who are they? One is top military class, right? Second, corporate, and third is politicians. Right? And this all three makes an oligarchy. Oligarchy, which rules America. These three oligarchy rules America. Now there is another theorist. His name is he talks about iron law of oligarchy, right? Of oligarchy. Now he argued that any organization, in any organization, right, decisions are taken by the few, only few. Any organization you see, any political party you see, whether it is a liberal party, the liberal democratic party, or socialist party, only few people takes decision. And he said it is valid in all kinds of organization, including democracy. What he called iron law of oligarchy. The few people rules everywhere, right? So that is basically elite theory of democracy, which is critical to pluralist understanding of democracy, right? Now let me move. There are any questions? Yeah. This is second A. What is the Marxist and liberal approach towards the state? What is Marxist and liberal approach towards the state? On what grounds theoretical differences between them premised? Explain. Now 20 marks questions. Now first you should talk about liberal understanding of state. State. For example, one should talk about John Locke, who talked about idea of limited state, right? And for liberals, state should be limited. Or one can give example of Adam Smith, who talk about laissez-faire state, fair state, laissez-faire state, that the state should be minimal, right? Then liberals also talks about the state should be, like a night watchman state. Night watchman state. Right? Basically, they focus on idea of limited state, right? A state should be very much limited. A state should be very much limited. On the other hand, people should have, rights and liberty. People should have rights and liberty. Should exercise rights and liberty. Now, yeah. And they also talked about economic freedom. Adam Smith talked about economic freedom of individual. Talked about economic freedom of individual. So after explaining liberal theory of a state, one can talk about, the Marxist understanding of state, right? For Marx, right? For Marx, the state is actually a committee, managing committee for the bourgeoisie. The state, for Marx, the state is a managing committee. Managing committee for the bourgeoisie. For the bourgeoisie, right? And later Lenin said that the state is an instrument in the hand of the bourgeoisie to exploit the working class. The state is an instrument in hand of bourgeoisie to exploit the proletariat, working class, right? So for them, for Marxists, for them, working class should overthrow the state. We don't need a state. Working class should overthrow a state. Right? So that is the understanding of state. Right? Now there was a two question in this question, right? So one is liberal approach. So liberal approach is a state should be limited. right? For Marxists, a state is an instrument in the hand of the bourgeoisie. A state is a managing committee for the bourgeoisie to exploit the working class. Now, second part of question is on what grounds theoretical differences between them are premised. That is important, right? If there are two questions, you equally focus on both of them rather than on one. Now, if you look at for liberal, a state is a neutral arbitration. A state is very neutral. For liberals, right? A state is a neutral or impartial institution. Impartial institution, right? It makes law for all, for all, for to live a good life, to live a good life, right? This is a liberal premise that a state is a very much neutral institution, impartial institution. Now, for Marxist, a state is not neutral. It gives impression of neutrality, right? It shows, it demonstrates, it reflects that I am neutral. But state is not neutral. A state always take the side of the bourgeoisie. A state always take the side of the bourgeoisie. And since the state takes always side of the bourgeoisie, it is an instrument in the hand of the bourgeoisie. Therefore, we don't need a state, right? A state is a bad institution. It is an exploitative institution, right? So for liberals, for Marxist, for Marxist, you know, a state is an instrument in the hand of the bourgeoisie, right? Basically, it is a tool in the hand of the bourgeoisie to exploit the working class, exploit the working class, right? Now, for Marxists also, a state sometimes gives impression of neutrality. A state gives impression of neutrality, right? For example, right? Uh, they allowed multi-party competition, allow multi-party competition, or declare welfare policy for the people, declare welfare policies for people, right? And people think that it is a neutral, right? Therefore people think that, therefore people think that it is natural, it is neutral or impartial, right? Now, but a state is not neutral. A state is not neutral or autonomous, right? However, it is relatively autonomous, as Gramsci argues. However, it is relatively autonomous, as Gramsci argued. Gramsci argued. Right. So this is, this is a premise on which both have different understanding of state. Liberal have understanding that the state is a neutral institution. It is very much, impartial institution. It is autonomous institution. It do good everyone. It maintains law and order for everyone. It does welfare to everyone. But if you look at, Marxists who argue that the state is basically, now Marx talked about state is actually a managing committee in the hand of the bourgeoisie. Lenin talked about, a state is actually instrument in the hand of the bourgeoisie. Gramsci talked about, look, a state exercises sometimes relative autonomy, right? Relative autonomy, right? It gives impression of neutrality by allowing freedom of press, or by allowing, multi-party competition, holding election, right? But it is not impartial or neutral, right? When crisis time comes, when the time of crisis comes, a state always take the side of the bourgeoisie. That is a basically basic premise of Marxist, and that's why they differ, you know in understanding of the modern state, right? So this is a very, I can say it was a very simple question. Now look at the next question. Karl Popper presents a defense of the open society. Again, it's against its enemy. Elaborate. One can write about Karl Popper books. So one can write Karl Popper in his book, or Popper in his book Open Society and its enemy criticizes several philosophers like Plato, Hegel, and Karl Marx for their philosophy of closed society. Of closed society. Now define closed society. Right? What is closed society? A closed society which do not allow criticism, right? Which do not allow criticism, do not allow dissent, right? you know Always wants a duty based, or obedience. Always want obedience, right? Right. It is a duty based. It is duty based, right? Basically it rejects rights. It rejects rights. That is a closed, character of the closed society. It does not allow, right, a criticism, right? The closed societies do not allow dissent. They don't, they want obedience. One should follow them blindly, right? It is a very much duty-based society. It rejects rights. Now look at open society. What is characteristic of open society? Open society. Now open society allow, discuss and debate. It allow dissent. It allow, you know, discussion, debate. It allow dissent, right? It allow free exchange of ideas, right? It talks about rule of law, right? It talks about equality, right? Now, for example, for example, Greek Athenian democracy. Athenian democracy was a very much open society. Now look at the modern democracy. The modern democracy also gives value. Modern democracy always gives value, right, for the open society. Right? Now look at Karl Popper argue that three philosophers, right, Plato, Hegel, and Marx, right, are the actually pioneer of modern totalitarianism. Modern totalitarianism right? And there are three common features in their philosophy. There are three common features in their philosophy. Right? What are they? You know, historicism, right? Then essentialism or holism or collectivism. And third, essentialism. Now, Karl Popper is very, very against the closed society, and he supports the open society. He was against, Hitler, right? And the society Hitler tried to, or Hitler and Mussolini on one hand, and communist Stalin used to want to establish it. So he was very against of modern totalitarianism, and he admired democracy, where people can exchange their ideas, where people can have right to dissent. What the idea? So that is a there are two section I have to explain now. Explain how Rawls used liberal and egalitarian perspective to develop his concept of distributive justice. So first, talk about Rawls' idea of distributive justice. So first, give a one line introduction or two lines introduction. Right, John Rawls is a great political philosopher of 20th century who wrote his book Theory of Justice. Theory of Justice, and proposed idea of distributive justice. Proposed idea of distributive justice. This way you can introduce to this question. Now, write about the core ideas or core argument of distributive justice. Core argument of John Rawls in his distributive justice. What Rawls says, that all social primary goods should be distributed equally unless an unequal distribution benefit to the least advantage. Right? I repeat what he said, the core idea he had given: all social primary goods, income, wealth, opportunity, liberty, right, honor should be distributed equally unless an unequal distribution benefit to the least advantage. Now one can write about the first principle, right? that is equal liberty principle. Said that every person should have equal liberty to the most extensive system, right? To the most extensive level, right? And that liberty should be available to everyone, right? Now, second principle was difference principle. Second principle is difference principle. Difference principle. Now, what is difference principle? He said economic and social inequality are to be arranged so that, you know, least benefit should be advantaged and office and position should be distributed under fair condition of equality and opportunity. Under the fair condition of equality and opportunity, right? So through first principles, he had prioritized liberal idea that liberty should be the primary one. On the other hand, through the second principle, he is addressing social and economic inequality, and he tried to establish an egalitarian society. Egalitarian society, so that a state, so that the least well off can benefit most from the distribution given by the state. Okay, so look at how Rawls used the liberal and egalitarian perspective to develop his concept of distributive justice. Right. Right. Now one can write criticism, right? For example, C.B. Macpherson has criticized that Rawls has used the liberal perspective in order to protect liberals and he is a champion of liberalism, right? Feminists also, criticized him, right? So one can put for 3-line criticism labeled by feminist as well as C.B. Macpherson, right? ज़्यादा करने की जरूरत नहीं है क्योंकि marks कम ही है, 15 marks. Now look at the third. Here, provide a comparative analysis of behavioral and institutional approach to the study of political theory. 20 marks का है, यानी 10 marks आपको इसमें बांट लेना है. 10 marks for behavioral approach, right, and 10 marks for institutional approach. Right. So one can write about the approaches to the to the study of political theory. So one can write the behavioral approach and institutional approach are the modern approach to analyze political theory, right? And it is different from the earlier approach like normative and legal approach, right? Now behavioral approach, developed after 1950s and 1960s, right? In the writing of several philosophers, like David Hastings, right, who tended to make social science their purpose was to make social science, as a science, right? And it should be value free. It should be completely value free. A behavioral movement was also has intention to drop out the value loaded term, right? Like justice, right? So behavioral approach focused, right, that how social science can be make science so that we can predict some idea. For example, what happened, like look at the natural science. In the natural science, right, the scientist basically is able to predict. Now, David Easton argued that even that should be applicable to the social science, and he developed system theory approach. He developed system theory approach, right? Later on, David S. Coleman has developed a structural functional approach. A structural functional approach. Right? That was based on a behavioral theory. Right? Now, one can write characteristics of the behavioral theory because it is 20 marks. So look at the behavioral theory's characteristics. It should be systematic, should be verified. There should be data, facts, right? Systematic analysis, right? So this should be the characteristics of behavioral approach. And its intention was to make the social science a value. Now look at, in this parallel, there was another approach that is called institutional approach. Institutional approach. Now institutional approach is, if you look at, there are two types of old institutional approach. There is a new institutional approach. Institutional approach. Now, old institutional approach focused on to study institutions, right? Like parliament, constitution, or even family at the society level, family, or for example, caste or race. For them, everything is institution. For institutionalists, everything is institutions. And if we study institutions, we can analyze politics in a correct way, right? We can understand, politics, whether it is a, local politics, whether it is a, national politics, or whether it is a international politics. If we, uh, study institutions, so for them, everything is institution. Now look at new institutional approach. They focused on not only the institutions, that is called formal institution, right? But they studied also formal institution means this is a formal institution, like parliament is a parliament, right? Or family, or race, or gender, right? Or constitution. But they also focused on informal institution. Informal institutions. Right. Now, what is informal institutions? Informal institution means, the informal relations. Informal relations. Right. Now, there are formal processes. Right. There are informal process. So, they also talked about informal processes. Right. For example, formal process of the passing budget. The budget is discussed in the parliament. But what is the informal process? The officers, discuss it, right? While they do dinner, all right? While they are on high tea, right? And they do lots of discussion. And that is informal discussion is implemented on the formal discussion. So they talked about formal process, informal relations, right? And their impact on the institutional, their institutional behavior or institutional approach, right? So if you look at the difference, behavioral says that we should not study institutions, we should study the behavior of the people. who, you know, who are in the institution. Look at behavioral approach. What behavioral approach argue that we should not study the institution, we should study the behavior of the people who actually are in the office, right? Who actually, part of that institutions. But institutional approach talks about, okay, we should not talk about the particular individual, but we talk about the particular institutions, right? There is also called historical institutionalism, right? If you look at later on, there was a several division of institutionalism, institutional approach, right? Now one is called historical institutionalism. Now historical institutionalism actually focus on the historical evolution of the institutions. Another is called sociological institutionalism. Now, the name already reflects sociological institutionalism reflects on the social institutions like caste, like gender, religion, language, right? Informal relations, right? Now, another is basically called, right, the cultural institutionalism. Cultural institutionalism. Basically, it is a more deeper part of the sociological institutionalism. So there are, various brands of institutionalism approach or institutional approach, right, which rejected the behavioral approach later on. So look at, there was a old institutional approach, behavioral approach came in, and they rejected the institutional and they talked about behavior of the people to be studied to understand the politics, right? That later on philosophers came and they rejected the behavioral approach because the behavioral approach itself declined in 1960, right? Because of lots of criticism behavioral approach has faced, right? And then there's a development of institutional approach, and there have been several, brands of institutional approach: historical institutionalism, sociological institutionalism, cultural, and so on and so on. So basically that is the, that is a comparative analysis of behavioral and institutional approach to the study of political theory. Yeah, now come to the Gandhi. 15 marks. A state does the greatest harm. A state does the greatest harm to the mankind by destroying individuality, which lies at the root of all progress. Now look at, of course, Gandhi, like liberal, like liberal, you know, was a champion of individualism. Or one can write about Gandhi. Gandhi was a great philosopher, right? But I'm explaining the answer, right? So Gandhi, like liberals, was a champion of individualism, right? But unlike liberals, he was critique to modern state. Gandhi was a champion of liberal individualism, right? But 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 unlike liberals, Gandhi was critique of Gandhi was critique of modern nation state. Modern nation state. Now why? Why he was a critique of modern nation state? Gandhi said the modern nation state is actually concentration of violence. For Gandhi, modern nation state, modern nation state is concentration of violence. or concentrated form of violence. Look at military, paramilitary, the weapon the modern state has possess, right? So modern state is concentrated form of violence. It put lots of restrictions. It puts lots of restrictions on individual, right? On it puts lots of instruction on individual, right? On the name of you know several law and order, right? And it does harm to the individuality. It does harm to individuality. So if you look at Gandhi was in favor of decentralization. And the state is what is the state? A state is just very much centralized. If you look at modern state is a very much centralized institution or centralized agency, right? Which has a weapon. The world largest biggest weapon is possessed by the modern state, like nuclear weapon, right? So he was actually against this centralized agency, and he talks about decentralization, right? Which promotes individuality, right? Which promotes true freedom, what he talks about, which promotes self-sufficiency, which promotes self-sufficiency, right? So he was very critique to modern state, and that's why Gandhi is called as a moral anarchist. Gandhi is right. Gandhi was moral anarchist. He did not like modern nation state, because modern nation state actually does lots of harm to the people, right? It limits freedom, and wherever freedom is limited, right, individual cannot do excellence in their life, right? So individual should be free, and that's why he was actually against the modern state, right? Let me move, right? Now explain how the slogan personal is political addresses the issue of women's oppression and discrimination. Right, so one should write about the second wave of feminism, or third wave of feminism, how the right, or radical feminism. One should start with radical feminism, right? So the personal is political was a slogan in radical feminism. During radical feminism, now radical feminist was critical to idea of personal and private, personal and public. Modern, if you look at the philosophers like Aristotle, talked about that the state should govern the public. He differentiate between personal. Personal means household, that is family, and the state. The state means the public sphere, right? Even the Greek defined political in terms of collective affair in the public sphere, collective affair in the public sphere, right? Like holding office. Now if you look at why public sphere should be governed, According to philosopher, the public sphere is subject to, law and order problem. It is subject to injustice. There's a anarchy in public sphere if you cannot rule it. But if you look at family, there is a natural hierarchy between man and woman, right? There is a friendship between man and woman in the family, as according to Aristotle, right? And other philosophers applied the same philosophy, and that personal should not be intervened. Personal should be not be intervened. Radical feminist basically was actually radical feminist challenged the dichotomy between private and public. If you look at radical feminist, no challenge the dichotomy between public and private, or you can say that personal. And they argued that within personal, with Western democracy, foundational base of Western democracy, right, is or is purely shaped by Locke's idea of constitutionalism, freedom, and property. Right now, after changing this pattern, what do you write about Locke? So, for example, Locke was a father of liberalism, father of liberalism, who has propounded several theories like constitutionalism, rule of law, representative democracy, representative democracy, tolerance, right? He talked about consent, right? Then limited state, and so on, right? And so on. So Locke was a champion of constitutionalism, rule of law, representative democracy, tolerance, consent of individual, limited state, individual rights, right? Now, if you look at John Locke, he was a champion of these values. Now, talk about the Western democracy. What the Western democracy does. Right? Western democracy are also champion of constitutionalism. Right? They are champion of rule of law. Right? The rule of law. Right? Individual rights. Then multi-party competition. Right? Individual rights, including right to property. Because property is there one part, including right to property. Right? They are champion of capitalism. Right? as Locke was also champion of capitalism, right? He is known as a father of liberalism, right? And if you look at the another side of liberalism is capitalism. The capitalism is basically the another face of same coin that is called liberalism, right? So he was a father of capitalism. So look at the Western democracy is basically shaped by, you know, the ideas of John Locke, his idea of constitutionalism, his idea of rule of law, his idea of individual rights, including right to property, his idea of right to liberty, right? His idea of right to liberty, right, life, liberty, and property, right? So pure, if you look at, that was a question. So let me move to the next question. Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt analyzed a few categories of vita activa. Vita activa. Hannah Arendt in her book Human Condition. So one can write about Hannah Arendt, two lines, that Hannah Arendt is one of the greatest philosophers of 20th century, right? She is called philosopher's philosopher. She is known as philosopher's philosopher, right? And she had written a series of great classical texts like The Human Condition, On Revolution, right? Ekmen in Jerusalem, right? And then now come to the Hannah Arendt talked about human activity into two parts. Now one is called, you know, vita contemplativa. Vita contemplativa, and second is vita activa. Now vita activa related to activity, right? Vita contemplativa all about contemplation, debate. Contemplation, or you can that debate and discussion, right? Now this activity, she said that there are three types of activity. One is called, she called labor. The most of the people actually we do labor. What is labor? Labor means whatever we produce, we consume, right? For example, if you look at workers, they they do the labor the entire day and they earn 200 rupees. Consider they earn 200 rupees, right? And the evening they actually consume all the 200 rupees, right? So there is no difference between what they earn and what they are consumed. So if you look at earning minus consumption is equal to 0. Earning minus consumption is equal to 0. Now such kind of people are basically labor, right? And he called such kind of people as man laboron. Right? Now if you look at such kind of work is called, such kind of activity is called man laboron. What you earn, you consume. Nothing left behind. Right? The most of people actually are doing like this. Now second is work. What is work? Work is you earn something, right? But you consume, but you leave something behind. For example, engineers, doctors, right? Innovators, artists, right? Whatever they earn, they did not consume everything. They leave something behind, right? Okay? So this is another kind of man, right? This is another kind of man. The third kind of action is called, third kind of activity he called action. Now what is action? He called this is a greatest kind of activity. What is this? The activity is you are free to do and discuss what is going on your state. We must be free, right, to become, creative. And we must do creative work. There should be no pressure on us, right? We must engage in politics. We must engage in politics. We must discuss and debate, right, the collective activity among the community. And we should not allow one person to be dictator or few person to be dictator, right? We must exercise power by our own community, right? And we must discuss and debate it. What happens in modern time? We speak not to express ourselves. We speak to reveal more than reflect less. Right? Most of the time we speak. Why we speak? We speak to reveal, not to reveal, to hide something. To hide something. Right? So Hannah Arendt talks about the vita activa, right? Three kinds of the work, activity, the labor, work, and action. And she talks about that the action is the greatest kind of work. Right? What is action? Engaging in politics, becoming innovative, doing what she called natality. So that is basically vita activa. Yeah. Third, right? We have to move to the second section as well. Do you think that legitimacy acquired by consent or manufactured by legitimacy acquired by the consent? Very important question. Or manufactured by indoctrination is an essential element in maintenance of political rule. Justify your answer with relevant examples. Do you think that legitimacy acquired by consent? So what is legitimacy? One can define legitimacy, right? Legitimacy implies acceptability. Acceptability. It is important in social and political life. It is important for stable social and political life, right? Because if you don't have acceptability, right, now you cannot sustain, you cannot be stable. People will start revolt against you, right? So now come to the consent. So legitimacy acquired by the consent. Now write about the modern democracy, right? Modern democracy, applies several tools to acquire legitimacy. Applies several tools to acquire legitimacy, right? For example, election, right? When you voted, election, then rule of law, third, constitutionalism, fourth, national festivals, fifth, education. Here you can write propaganda. Education slash propaganda, or education को education रहने दो, चलो media. Right? Modern democracy also use media, na? You here you can write propaganda. Propaganda. Right? So modern democracy applies several tools to acquire legitimacy. Right? Now you can write the answers. Now you have written the background for your answer. Now you write it. Do you think that legitimacy acquired by consent or manufactured by indoctrination in an essential element in maintenance of political? So you can write the modern, or in the last in the 21st century, there has been rise of right wing political regime in every part of the world. Every part of the world, like Argentina, or not comparative politics. So of course you can give example Argentina, right? Then US, Italy, Iran, and India. Right? Now media is very much used. Media has been used to manufacture consent. Manufacture consent. Right? Modern leaders had used modern leaders have used media to spread propaganda. Have used media, for propaganda and indoctrination of their followers. Indoctrination in their followers. Right? For example, Hitler used it. Hitler used it. Right? Now you can write that, as Gramsci argues that the civil society organizations like media manufacture consent. Manufacture consent. Right? To rule. Right? The modern democracy of the world uses, the political regime of the world is using, several tool in order to manufacture consent. Right? Further, they do engage in indoctrination in their followers to maintain their rule. For example, Iran. Right? For example, I would look at Erdogan, Turkey. Right? ये क्वेश्चन सेकंड पेपर में पूछना चाहिए था, बट इसी पेपर में पूछा है. No issue. You have to answer. Now let's move to section B. Right? Half of questions we have done. Half is still, and we have limited time. Explain briefly the role of peasant movement after 1957 and before independence. There have been several peasantry movement For example, if you look at the peasant movement in Bengal, so one can talk about the peasant movements in Bengal, then indigo plantation movement, plantation issues, then Champaran Satyagraha, right? That was Gandhi, yeah. The Gandhi first experiment, that was a peasantry movement that solved the indigo problems in Bihar, right? In Maharashtra, there was a issue of Sahukar. In Maharashtra, there was a problem of Shahukar, that is money lender, right? In Kerala, there was a problem of you know a landlord and increasing rent issue, right? And there was a Mopla revolt in Kerala, right? Now look at Deccan. British was actually grabbing land of the people, right? So there was a movement against the land grabbed by the Britishers. Now come to the Chota Nagpur. There was a Munda movement, right? Munda movement against Britishers and again landlord, right? So this was basically. Then if you look at the peasantry movement, now come to the argument here, right? Now if you look at two argument is important. One is Roy, who argued that the Indian National Congress, right, supported by the big landlord, right? Then petty bourgeoisie, including intellectual class, and also peasantry and workers, right? Now, if you look at Gandhi represented the big landlord and petty bourgeoisie. He was a leader of the bourgeois, and peasantry, interests remain untouched and unaddressed by the movement, the Indian national movement. Right. Now, second is one can talk about, subalternist philosopher, subaltern historians argument, right? Like Ranjit Guha, who argued that the peasantry has participated in national movement, right? But they themselves unable to represent their interests. The peasantry movement played a very important role in Indian national movement, but they remained, unable to represent their interest at the, from the leadership level, right? And they remain aloof, right? They did not get any fruits of Indian national movement. So the two argument one can make. Now write on Dalit perspective on Indian national movement. Now you can write, the dominant national movement was Congress. The dominant, movement was the Indian National Congress movement, right? And there was a, OBC. There was a OBC movement, movement, or you can say that, anti-Brahminist movement. Movement in South and Maharashtra. Maharashtra. Now look at Dalit has taken idea from there. Dalit perspective was inspired from anti-Brahmana movement. Anti-Brahmin movement. Right? Dr. Ambedkar presented Dalit perspective on Indian national movement. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar presented Dalit perspective on Indian national movement. National movement. Now for INC, political freedom was important. Political freedom was important. For Dalit, like Ambedkar, right? Social freedom was important. For and there was a Pune Pact. One must talk about Pune Pact, right? When the Pune Pact was a pact between Gandhi and Ambedkar, right? After when Ramsay MacDonald has given separate electorate to the to depressed classes, right? And Gandhi did not accept that. Gandhi went on fast on to death, right? And then Ambedkar considered that okay, we are actually giving up, right? We give up this separate electorate based on Dalit, right? Now Gandhi offered, reservation. Now in this way, if you look at here, there was a discussion between Gandhi and Ambedkar. Gandhi said to Ambedkar that you should leave your demand of separate electorate for this nation. Ambedkar replied, "Where is my nation, Bapu?" Ambedkar established Bahiskrit Bharat as organization. So look at Ambedkar, established Dr. Ambedkar established several newspapers, right? Like Muknayak, Janata, Muknayak, right? He led several organizations. For example, Bahiskrit Bharat, right? He led several movements like Mahat Satyagraha, movement for Mahat Satyagraha, right? And then if you look at, he also led several political party, like for example, All India Scheduled Caste Federation, or for example, that is called Labour Party, right? Then also Republican Party of India, Republican Party of India. So he had, did lots of effort to make India free, and their vision was social freedom rather than political freedom. Dalit perspective was more focused on social freedom rather than political freedom. Political freedom, right? So that was actually Dalit perspective on India's national movement. Or they're more so they were very critical to Congress. They were critical to Gandhi. Land reforms programs led to some constitutional amendments. Yeah, the first amendment to the constitution actually instigated by the land reform, right? So land reform programs, one can talk about land reform, right? Land reform, right? And it's why land reform was done. So there was a Jamindari reform, right? There was a tenancy reform, right? And if you look at, there was a land is a state matter. Land is a state subject, right? So several state has passed land reform act. The state has passed had passed land reform act. Right. For example, UP Land Reform Act, Bihar Land Reform Act. Right. Now, what happened in 1951? The Patna High Court declared Bihar Land Reform Act as a ultra virus to the Constitution. Why? Because Article 31 of the Indian Constitution, had given a right to property. Right? So Patna High Court declared Bihar Land Reform Act as a null and void. And if you look at, then there was a first Constitutional Amendment Act. First Constitutional Amendment Act. Right? It added ninth schedule. It added ninth schedule. Right? And ninth schedule, if you look at any law that has been put in the ninth schedule, shall be, out of the judicial review. Judiciary cannot look into it. Right? Then if you look at Article 31, Article 31A and Article 31B has been added. Right? To nullify the, Supreme Court intervention in order to implement the land reform. So basically, the first constitutional amendment was due to because of the land reform. Of course, Article 15 clause 4 was also added. Look at Article 19, there was some restrictions on freedom. When the word reasonable, restrictions in Article 19, the word reasonable was added by the first Constitutional Amendment Act. So lots of amendment was done. But of course, one of the major reason was land reform. So next is delineate the key factors that have shaped the evolving political landscapes in Jammu and Kashmir post 2019. Right? Here, this question asks you that explain the key factors that has shaped the evolving political landscapes in Jammu and Kashmir, right? In the post 2019. So one can write about Jammu and Kashmir, Article 370, right? Article 370 has been abolished, right? And there was a reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir, reorganization of a state of Jammu and Kashmir Act and Kashmir Act, which made Jammu and Kashmir as a right? UTs, and then it was also Ladakh. Ladakh is also UT. So Jammu and Kashmir lost the state of statehood. Now Jammu and Kashmir has UT with legislature, right? Having chief minister, you know, having council of minister with headed by chief minister, headed by CM. Now one can write about the the power and functions of the assembly of the Jammu and Kashmir, right? So Jammu and Kashmir assembly, JNK assembly can make all the law, right, except police and law and order, right? On which they cannot make law, right? It is governed by the center, right? And there had been several issues like security issues that has evolved in Kashmir. Then there was a development. One can write about the 15th Finance Commission recommendation. 15th Finance Commission recommendation that 1% of the budget of the tax revenue collected by the by the central government should go for the development of Jammu and Kashmir. Jammu and Kashmir. Kashmir, there is a constant demand of the Jammu and Kashmir to restate the statehood, right? So that is a evolving political landscapes in Jammu and Kashmir in the 2019. Now let me move to the next question. How far has been National Human Rights Commission successful in achieving objectives? Comment. Right, so one can write about National Human Rights Commission, NHRC, right, which does it is a statutory body established in 1992, which act upon several work uh, to protect the human rights, right? Okay. Now you can write about the objectives and goals of NHRC, right? And one can give you example, right? So give example of Salwa Judum. Judum, right? Where the intra-tribal fight has been declared invalid by the Supreme Court, right? Now you can write also criticism that of course it is an overarching body, right? We already have National Commission for SC, National Commission for ST, National Commission for Women, National Commission for Minority, right? National Commission for NCPCR. We have several, right? And there is a already overlapping of work that NHRC is facing. However, we can say that NHRC has actually achieved its mixed results, mixed objectives, right? However, in the last few decades, NHRC is facing problem, right? NHRC is facing problem due to non-appointment of its members. Now we have 5 minutes, and I don't know how many 5 minutes. I will justify. Yeah. Now look at the parliamentary committee. Question on parliamentary committee are indispensable to the legislative process. It provides for the opportunity for cross pollination between the two chambers of the parliament discuss. Now one can write about the parliamentary committee. What is parliamentary committee, right? And why parliamentary committee is indispensable. right? So one can write the what parliamentary committee does, right? It inquires CAG reports, right? Then what it does, it enables the parliament to work smoothly, right? It examines bills and submit report to the parliament, right? Then what it does, right? Um, it it examines grants in aid, not only grants in aid, demand of grants. It examines demand of grants. That is called DG for each department of the government, right? So look at the work of the parliamentary committee. It ensures accountability of the government. It ensures accountability of the government, right? So these are the major point in this question, right? Now it provides the for the opportunity for cross pollination between the two chambers, because you can give example of the parliamentary committee. There are parliamentary committee where the members of the Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha are the member, right? For example, Public Account Committee, PSC, where you have 15 member from Lok Sabha and 7 member from the Rajya Sabha, right? So if you look at DRSC, right? Now there is a member from the Lok Sabha as well as member from the Rajya Sabha, Departmental Related Standing Committee, right? So basically it provides an opportunity for cross pollination between the Rajya Sabha and the Lok Sabha, both. The idea. Now let me move to the next. Examine constitutional provisions and nature of advisory jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Basically, we have to talk about Article 143, the advisory. 143 or 142? 143, the advisory jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Now look at Supreme Court can give the exam advice on political issues. It is issues, and then advise on legal issues like treaty, like international treaty. So that is actually constant, the advisory jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, right? Now you can one can give example on the Babri Mosque demolition, or for example appointment of the election commission, right? Time is over. Let me touch one more two questions, very short, or I should stop here. I'll stop here, right? As time does not permit me. I know I was a little fast, but yes, it was necessary to, right? Like in the examination, yes, you have to write very fast. Otherwise, many questions will be left. Chalo, see you then. I'll stop here. See you.